Lake George Battlefield Moments, a production of the Lake George Battlefield Park Alliance, preserving our area's incredible history. A weekly feature on 93.5 FM and live streaming at lakefm.com. Here's the president of the Lake George Battlefield Park Alliance, John Denuzzo.
Welcome to Lake George Battlefield Moments podcast. This is John Denuzzo of the Lake George Battlefield Park Alliance Board of Trustees. And it's a great pleasure, particularly in light of what's happened at Lake George Battlefield Park in the last week or so, to welcome Andrew Pharmer. He's a partner in Workshop Art Fabrication of Hingston, New York. His firm recently oversaw the refurbishment of the 3 bronze sculptures in Lake George Battlefield Park. The Battle of Lake George, which many people know as the Johnson Hendrick statue, which was dedicated in 1903. The Mohawk Warrior, which was completed in 1921. And Isaac Jogues, the newest of the 3, which was designated just before the start of World War II in Europe in 1939. Welcome, Andrew.
Thanks, John.
Andrew, I learned a lot from you directly and indirectly, but could you describe for our listeners what it is your firm does?
I suppose the short answer is we make art for artists. When artists want to make metal sculptures, there's a lot of craftsmanship that needs to be applied there that the artists just don't have skill-wise in their studio. So we help out with that. Like, strictly speaking, we're a foundry. I guess the main thing is that what we do is we provide foundry services, which is casting metal for artists, which is something they just can't do in their studio.
For new works, do you actually go on site and install sculptures, or is that left to the artist, or is it a combination?
We typically don't install. There's companies that specialize in that. There's art movers that just do rigging and installation of work. What we're typically covering is when the artist delivers the artwork to our door, be it an original sculpture or a digital file. We take it from there, produce the metal sculpture, and then it's picked up by installers or art handlers, is what we say.
Okay, well, that helps. All right, now let's get back to Lake George now. I know you grew up here before you made your mark in the art world. What are your memories of the Battlefield Park from your childhood?
It's funny, growing up in Lake George, you think that every town is like Lake George. And so I just assumed that every town had a park like that, and every town had a strip with arcades and boats and lakes. And it wasn't until leaving Lake George that you discover that that's not typical. But yeah, I remember, hanging out in the park, and there's such a fixture that I didn't give much thought to them as sculptures at that point, because, as an artist in high school, I was thinking I was going to design album covers or something like that. So I just remember the pieces being like, I can remember playing Frisbee out in front of the Jogues, because that's a nice huge field. And, I think I told you earlier, we had our senior picnic in the pavilion by the Mohawk Warrior. So that's always in my memory.
I think the sculptures must have had some impression on you, even in the subconscious, as you progressed in your career. Was there anything about them that stuck with you as you grew in the profession?
When you start making art, and especially public art, looking back to the sculptures we had in Lake George, like those are really high quality sculptures. Like, they're really well executed from an artistic standpoint, and also, challenging to produce from the foundry's standpoint as well. The Mohawk being a fountain, that's pretty incredible. That thing is still working after all these years. And that speaks to the craftsmanship of the original fabricators. The Jogues piece is just monumental. I never appreciated that, now that this is my main business, is making sculptures like that. That sculpture should cost like $1 million today.
Wow.
It's something that you don't really appreciate until you're in the business. Like, there's, just getting that stone carved, and the quality of the stonework is really beautiful. It's just an incredible piece.
Wow. Well, we agree with you, and we're thrilled of the whole work that you and your team have done in these last few months. So for the listeners who haven't made it to the Battlefield Park since the restoration has occurred, and we are doing, as we record this, it's a week away, June 27th, the formal rededication, but Can you tell us what specific work that the workshop art fabrication did on our statues, and was it more or less of a challenge than other jobs you've done?
We could start with the Mohawk Warrior. He was missing 2 arrows that were taken by vandals at some point. And so we looked at historical images, and we resculpted new arrows and made rubber molds of that. And, we cast via lost wax. So we cast the new arrows in bronze and then, brought them on site and fit them and welded them in place. They were repatinaed. The patina is the color of the bronze, and they were repatinaed to match the original color. I think they look really terrific, seamless. Like you couldn't tell that they weren't always there.
Agree.
And then, the Jogues sculpture, we came up and it seemed that perhaps a tree had come down, or a tree limb had come down and bent his cross. So we came up to the site, we removed the cross and brought it back to our shop and did some cutting and welding to square up the cross so it's not drooping to one side any longer. And when we didn't have to do any new casting there, that was all just straight fabrication. And brought that back up to the site, welded it back to the sculpture on site, and repatinaed the area to match.
How about the oldest of the sculptures, the Battle of Lake George, featuring William Johnson and King Hendrik?
And that sculpture, the sculpture itself is in really terrific condition. So we just washed and waxed the sculpture. So the bulk of the work there was to replace the tomahawks on the entry gate. And that's kind of an interesting process because it's something that's kind of new to our industry. Within the last 10, 20 years, we've started scanning instead of molding objects. And because you had 2 tomahawks existing on the gate that were original, we were able to come up and digitally scan the pieces. And then we produced files from that scan data, printed the parts to be cast, and then they were also cast in bronze. And because we scanned the mating surfaces where the pieces were missing, it was very little work to reattach the tomahawks back where they belong.
Well, you say very little work, but it amazes someone such as I in terms of how complicated that would be. And for those who don't recall, the right side of the entry gate to the Johnson Hendrik sculpture had 2 tomahawks. The left side also did, but at some point in history, they went missing, and Andrew's firm recast them as he described to make it a balanced, so there's 2 tomahawks on each side as you look at the entry gate. Tell us about Dan George. I mean, Dan George, I know you had a business relationship. Incredibly, he reached out to me last summer, really kicked this thing into motion. I never got to meet Dan George, and I regret that, but we had a terrific...
Oh, that's too bad.
Yes, we had a terrific relationship on the phone. Tell me about Dan George and the whole evolution of how you came to work at this site through Dan.
Yeah, Dan is an interesting guy. He, my father also grew up in Lake George, and Dan went to school with my dad. And how I ended up meeting Dan is he lives in Kingston, or lived in Kingston, which is where my foundry is. And so he just walked in the door one day, and I was working on a project out on the floor, and this guy comes up behind me and he says, "Are you Andrew Pharmer?" And I said, "Well, yes. How can I help you?" And he's like, "I went to school with your dad." And I'm like, my dad had passed away like 3 or 4 years ago at that point. And so I was really confused where this was coming from. And, I wasn't sure this guy was on the level,
Sure, right.
But then he explained himself further, and, we had a nice time talking about Lake George memories and his memories of growing up, just blocks away from my father.
Wow. And he became, of course, a world-class sculptor himself, and came to you about the Lake George project. Can you kind of tell us about how you connected on this?
Yeah, Dan, we had worked on a few projects together over the years, and he just, as he would every now and then, just walked in the shop and presented me with the idea of doing this restoration. I had told him that over the years I had considered proposing the restoration to you guys as well, because the sculptures were in pretty deplorable condition. Dan was of the same mind. I guess he went up last summer and saw the pieces, and he's like, I know just who could fix these things up. So he came to me. He was really gung ho, and he's like, we're going to figure it out. Even if they don't come up with money, we'll figure out how to get it done. So that's how we started the project.
Fantastic. For those who don't know, Dan, while he was thinking of this project, reaching out to Andrew, reaching out to me, was in a battle with terminal cancer, and he succumbed to that on January 4th of this year. The last conversation I had with him was on December the 19th, I think it was, and I told him, hey, Dan, we got our first funding for this project from the Lake George Park Commission to work on the Jogues sculpture. He said, great. He started talking more about the plans, and he gave me his wife, Erica Mark's contact information. He said, I'll be going into hospice care tomorrow. It was so important speaking with him and speaking with Erica subsequently to get this done, that he wanted this without saying he wanted to be his legacy. He wanted it as a legacy for his hometown, which is just a terrific story. Boy, this time has gone fast, Andrew. I do want to ask you, though, give us a couple of other projects that you and your firm have been involved in, elsewhere.
Sure, yeah. Usually we work in, modern art and contemporary, and so we're usually producing contemporary art. We always do some restoration, but mostly we're making new work. Like right now we're working with Kiki Smith on a project for the Obama Presidential Center, and we also did some samples of textures for the Obama Presidential Center. They're doing some white bronze casting for that. So they brought us in for some R&D on that project. And we just finished a huge project for us last fall. It was a Nick Cave project at Jack Shainman Gallery down in the city. And that was a real feather in our cap, because it was a 26-foot tall sculpture. It's the largest thing we had made to date. And we've done some monument work. We did the LGBT memorial down in New York City on the west side. And right now we have a project on the Metropolitan Museum of Art roof garden for Jenny C. Jones. And that's sort of like a modern abstract piece. We do quite a variety, and that's what keeps the work interesting,
Yeah, I'll bet. And it's a great story. Another local boy who was made well in the larger world. Can you tell us, I know you have something going on locally as well, without being parochial. Can you tell us about that? Or I'm thinking about Fort Edward.
Oh yeah. The Fort Edward project, where that's another restoration. That one is actually really challenging, because the original sculpture is it's not cast bronze, it's stamped bronze. And the sculpture has a really strange history. They were producing these stamped bronze sculptures. It's a really weird sculpture. I looked up the history of it, and the company that made the sculpture also made kitchen cabinets, like these stamped steel kitchen cabinets. Then there was, like in the 30s, there was a lot of Civil War monuments being put up. So they started producing these stamped Civil War monuments. So I guess what happened is in that sculpture, there's an internal steel armature that rusted out over the years. And so what we did is we went up to Fort Edward and collected this statue of a life-size Union soldier. And we have him at the shop right now, and we're peeling away his skin a little bit and putting in new armature, then welding him back together. So we should be done with that inside of a month, I would think. And that's a really challenging sculpture. I've never seen a sculpture made like that one. It's bizarre. It's like it's bronze plates, lead soldered together.
Well, to connect it back to Lake George Battlefield Park, we can say that's another arrow in your quiver.
Yeah, there you go.
But no, I know that talking with the Fort Edward folks, they are like we have been here. They are thrilled that you have a vision, you've taken this job on, and they look forward to that restoration. Thank you so much for all the work you've done here in your hometown. Again, we're speaking in advance of the rededication ceremony, but my understanding is that you and Vinny DiDonato will be back with us for that ceremony on June 27th. And
that's right, we will.
That's great. Thanks so much, Andrew. Our Battlefield Park Alliance website is lakegeorgebattlefield.org. I'm John Denuzzo. Thank you for tuning in.
Lake George Battlefield Moments, a production of the Lake George Battlefield Park Alliance, preserving our area's incredible history. For more on this topic, check out the Lake George Battlefield Park Alliance podcast, a weekly feature on Lake FM 93.5 FM and live streaming at lakefm.com. For more information, go to info@lakegeorgebattlefield.org and tune in every Saturday morning for Lake George Battlefield Moments.